It's always nice to come to Stellenbosch. It doesn't really matter what the weather is like, it's normally shit, but it's always nice. It's always nice to come to Stellenbosch. So I thought what would be useful this afternoon is if we talk about, if I give you the topic or talk to you about the topic, finding the good Anthropocene, is that how you pronounce it? Finding the good Anthropocene in the South African labour market. Because as much as we talk about things on an elevated level, the minute you start talking about it in practical terms, the context does change a little bit. So here is the basic lie of the land. There are 20 million people in the South African labour market. 5 million of them are not working or are unemployed, and 15 million are working. The 5 million is probably an undercount, depending on which definitions you use, but let's use the international ILO definitions, it just makes it easier. 5 million people not working, 15 million are working. How has this changed? Now, I think this 15 million working, there's one figure which is important. The 15 million people working actually represent what you can call an employment rate. An employment rate of 42%. So 42% of the working age population of South Africa, everybody between 15 and 64, are working. And 5 million are not working, and that gives you 5 million, that shouldn't be a percentage, sorry, 5 million are not working, and that gives you an unemployment rate of around about 25%. Last week there was a report saying 24.5. Let's not fight about that. It's 25%. How has this changed since democracy? Well, in 1995, not in 94, but in 1995, we had 9.5 million people working. At that point, there were 2 million people, actually 1.9, but with your permission, I'm going to round it off to 2. There were 2 million unemployed people. The unemployment rate in 1995 was 18%, and the employment rate at that point was 39%. So here you can see some really good news. We've created 5.5 million jobs over 19 years. That phrase, jobless growth, complete crap. Complete crap. You cannot have a jobless growth if you create 5.5 million jobs. It's mathematically just not possible. So you've got to find a different explanation for your problem. But you cannot blame jobless growth. Clearly not. What happened on the other side of the coin, the unemployed people went from 1.9 million, 2 million, or 18% to 5 million people, or 25%. Now, how do you explain this paradox? The paradox of creating more jobs on the one hand, but at the same time having more people unemployed. How do you explain this paradox? And I think if you want to find the good seeds and the bad seeds, try and unpack that one. Now, I don't know what the answer is. I will suggest some solutions. The first one is plain demography. People that were born in the year that Mr. de Klerk became President of South Africa would today be around about 26 years old. And people who were born in the year that Mr. Mandela left Robben Island would now be roughly 30, 31 years old. So the one thing is the problem was born a long time ago. And a quarter of a century later, it hits you. Because a quarter of a century later, you are in the labor market. And you're looking for a job. And you want to have a career and money and so on. So demography is one. I think the second one is the old one. Who's responsible for half the problems in the world? Well, obviously women. Men are responsible for the other half. So what you've had in the last 30 years was an enormous change in the social position of women in South Africa, and by definition in the South African labour market. When Thabo Mbeki was inaugurated in his second term as president, he used a phrase in his speech which took me a while to understand. I only understood it 6 months later. He said Africa would not be liberated before the women of Africa are not liberated. And he repeated it a few times. And if you think about that comment, it is actually very, very profound. And what we've seen in the last 30 years in South Africa, 40 years, is the massive liberation of women. Now that's fantastic news in every single respect, except you now have a much bigger supply into the labour market. So is there an impact on your unemployment numbers? I'll leave that with you. And the third possible explanation, look, if you live in the Valley of 1,000 Hills in KwaZulu-Natal, and you have a subsistence existence, then statistically you literally do not count. You're not counted as unemployed, you're not counted as employed. If you're lucky, you may be counted in the census. But the minute you leave the Valley of 1,000 Hills, or if you want to think Western Cape, you come from Barrydale, or you come from Jubotina, Tweede and the Langkloof, and you move to George, or you move to Stellenbosch, and now at Stellenbosch you become a car guard. Suddenly you get picked up in the labour force surveys. So to what extent has social forces like urbanization and the liberation of women contributed to the unemployment problem? I throw these things out to you to get a better grip on the issue of South African unemployment, because the old explanation of jobless growth just doesn't hold. It simply just doesn't hold. Now looking forward, you can actually summarize the entire forward-looking discussion with one number, and that number is the number 0.5, which has now changed to 1. And what do I mean by that? For the last 70 years, for as long as we've got data for 7 decades, the so-called employment coefficient in South Africa, in other words, how many jobs do you create with 1% economic growth? The economists like to talk about the employment coefficient. The employment coefficient for South Africa has been 0.5. So every 1% GDP growth gives you 0.5% growth of the number of jobs in your labour market. How does this compare to other countries? Most other developing economies are sitting at around 0.6, thereabouts. Okay, so we are slightly behind, and we can up that number a bit. But an interesting thing has happened in the last couple of years. This employment coefficient has changed, depends how you measure it, but it has moved much closer to 1. So what on earth is going on in the South African labour market? Are we becoming more labour intensive? Are we suddenly is the South African economy more conducive to job creation? You know, what's the story here? And the story is, I think, we don't have a full answer, but I think my speculation has everything to do with the government's public employment programs. What is a public employment program? Well, it's work creation programs run by the government, where you can get 50 Rand a day. That's sort of the going wage at the moment. And if you're lucky, you get a job for 3 months. If you're very lucky, you will have a job for 6 months. For example, building a school, or helping to build a road, or whatever. Work for water is a classic example. What is the one for fire? Not working for fire, but working against fire. Well, sometimes, of course, you work for fire in order to be able to work against fire. And there you might have a job for 6 months. My favorite is food for trash. Some 85 municipalities are now on food for trash, involving about 100,000 people. And how it works, you've got to have an ID book. So it starts there. You bring people into the system. And once you've got an ID book, you can go to your local municipality if they participate, register, and then for 2 days a week, you go to the municipality, they give you a black bag. You walk around picking up litter, picking up rubbish, and for every black bag that you take back, trash, you get a food coupon. And then you can go and cash the food coupon in for food. If you're stupid, you go to Woolworths. If you're clever, you go to Checkers. You know, that sort of thing. There's a wonderful story here from Stellenbosch, which really, for me, encapsulates it all. The late Mrs. Rupert, at the stage when her husband was already a billionaire in any currency on the globe. Doesn't matter which currency, he was a billionaire. She still used to do her shopping in OK Bazaars, downtown. And she would always go there with her 2 bags, fill them up, and then she would go off to her car. I mean, even when she could hardly walk, she still did that. And so one day, Mrs. Rupert bumped into my friend Anne-Marie and she said to Anne-Marie, "Oe," in Afrikaans, let me translate it. "Oe, jy shop ook hier. Oh, you're also shopping here at OK Bazaars?" And Anne-Marie says, "Yes." "Yeah," says Mrs. Rupert, "that's very good. Woolworths is only for the rich people." So you get your coupon, you go to Checkers, you swap your bag of rubbish, your bag of litter for a food coupon. That's the kind of program that we're talking about. Now, you will agree with me, this is not a job in the real sense of the word. This is not a job in the way that you and I normally understand this. There's one group of people in South Africa who cannot get this into their heads, and that's the economists who keep on counting expanded public works jobs as civil service jobs. Now, I leave it to you to decide whether the person who gets 50 Rand a day for 3 months or 6 months is really equivalent to a policeman
or a nurse, or a teacher, or a university lecturer, you know, the kind of people that form the majority of the state payroll. But this kind of nonsense thinking does permeate our public thinking, and it's got one enormous downside. It means that we don't really come to grips with the real problems. As long as you regard these people as civil servants and they start shouting and screaming that there are too many civil servants in South Africa, well then you can't have a lot of discussion about fiscal priorities, fiscal allocation and so on. So the question that one has to ask yourself, if you take the government public works program out of the numbers, how much will be left over? And we don't know because we haven't taken the numbers out. But the best work on this regard has been done by Frederick Fourie at the University of the Free State. And I have an enormous regard for Frederick's abilities. And Frederick comes up with a number of around about 0.6%. So this is a number to consider when you want to talk about unemployment and the future. If you want to reduce this 5 million that you've got over here, what seeds can you plant? What initiatives can you bolster? What is currently going on that you can help along? Now, we have a couple of things. We've got the government's public employment program. I think that's got a natural limit. At the moment, they've got 1.5 million people in the program. The target is to go to 6 million. You know, it's a big operation to run. And I would like, let's first see whether they make the 6 million. And even if they do, then there's still a lot of people that don't have jobs. Then there's the wage subsidy. The wage subsidy, as you know, is highly successful so far, but the Treasury projections are you're looking at about 180,000 net new jobs. Now, 180,000 is to be welcomed. Don't sniff, don't sneeze at it. But I think you will agree with me, 180,000, it speaks for itself. I'm not against the wage subsidy. I fully support it, but context. And the third one is you've got the jobs fund, which I think is now standing at about 110,000 jobs and rising. None of these that I've mentioned to you, public employment, the jobs fund, and the wage subsidy, none of them are game changers. None of them are game changers. So how are you going to deal with the 5 million? And so the only game changer that is really left over is economic growth. And the empirical evidence is with us. Between 2003 and 2007, we grew the economy at 5% a year and we created 500,000 jobs a year. We created 2 million jobs in 4 years. And then the economic growth went down to 3%, and what happened to job creation? Well, it collapsed. And at the moment, if you accept that our long-term economic growth is going to be 3%, and that is a push, I think, then you end up with 1.8% growth in the labour market. That's less than 300,000 jobs a year. You have 500,000 new people coming in looking for jobs. You create at best 300,000, deficit 200,000, multiply by 25 years. Well, you can do the numbers yourself. And the only thing that can change this is much, much higher economic growth, which takes us right into where we are today in this discussion in this room. How is that reconcilable with the other constraints that we face? Resource constraints, environmental constraints. Is it realistic at all to think of 5 and 6% growth to solve South Africa's unemployment problems? I don't think we're going to grow at 5%, but nevertheless, the one thing on which left and right at the moment in South Africa absolutely agree. They're converging on their thinking around Mr. Zuma. But the point where they've already reached convergence, is that we need high growth, and that growth must be 5% plus. So on that, left and right agree. But to what extent is this doable? To what extent is that a sustainable trajectory? And if you say we can't do that, and you say we're not going to do that, what then do you say to the 5 million unemployed people? Are you saying to them, you are in a hugely privileged position to sacrifice a career and not have a job and live in poverty because it's good for the environment? Well, good luck to you to go and sell that. If you can sell it, you will no doubt become president. We owe it to we owe it to our compatriots to answer that question in a very credible and diligent way. And that's really the full thing that I want to give you about the labour market. Let's rather have your questions and comments and chat about them.